In this video, we'll be taking a look at Harman Phoenix 200. Harman Phoenix 200 is a daylight balanced color negative film with an ISO of 200, and it features punchy contrast and vibrant color. Okay, so that's how the film is marketed, but it doesn't actually have an ISO of 200. In fact, it hardly has any dynamic range at all. This is the film rated at 200, and I metered for the shadow area at a zone 4 or a -1 exposure for this one, and it appears much darker than that. So you can see that the film doesn't have much shadow detail. It's pretty much all dark and light. It's very contrasty. There's not much mid-tone, and there's very little dynamic range. And here's the same scene again, but this time -2 stops, and the exposure pretty much falls off. There's like no shadow detail here. Pretty much goes all dark. So obviously this is way underexposed. So I think the most you can really do is 1 stop underexposure. And then even then, I feel like 1 stop is getting to pretty drastic. So you would want to do incremental exposures like 1/3 or 1/2. I think the reasoning for the ISO rating of 200 is more so for the color saturation than the shadow detail, because obviously from the results, there's not much shadow detail, and even if you rate your film at 200, you're not going to get the shadows that you're metering for. Taking a look at this, the color saturation gets really soft if you overexpose, and you can see that the colors get very desaturated. Of course, with any color film, when you underexpose, the colors are going to get more saturated, but these colors at just a middle gray exposure, a zone 5, they're like pastel, so I think they're unusable. Now if we go 1 stop darker, the colors look much better. They're a lot more saturated and they look closer to where they should be, but the rest of the image goes very dark, very underexposed. So there's not much latitude there. They're either too bright or shadows fall off. Right about now you might be thinking, well, what if you rate the film at 100? Maybe you can pull out a little more shadow detail. Well, I thought the same thing, and I tried that too, but you encounter another problem. So here's the film at 100 and a -1 exposure, and you can see that the highlights are pretty much blowing out. Everything that's on the brighter side is like glowing, and the film reportedly doesn't have an anti-halation layer, and I think that helps the film from the highlights blowing out. So now you have a little bit better shadow detail, but you have these blowing out highlights. Here's the film at 100 and -2 stops. So all things considered, I think this actually looks pretty good. I like this. The color saturation is good. The contrast is okay. Like I said earlier, you're not really going to get great shadow detail out of this film, and if you do increase exposure, you're just going to get blown out highlights. So you kind of have to meet somewhere in the middle. If you look at these two side by side, you have ISO 100 -2 stops on the left and ISO 200 -2 stops on the right. I do think you get an improvement when rating the film lower at 100, but I think overall probably 100 is a little bit too much. I think the film might be better around like 160. I did also shoot something with text on this film just for the heck of it. It's a lo-fi film like through and through. It's low resolution, low dynamic range, grainy, and not super sharp, but just for the heck of it and for this video so we can take a look. Here's some text. Doesn't look great, but there it is. So what are the key takeaways with Harman Phoenix 200? Well, it's very much a beta film, so don't expect any great results because this feels very much like an unfinished film. There's not much dynamic range, so when you're exposing this film, I think instead of going with full stop exposure adjustments, do 1/3 stop or half stops. The film is very low resolution. You can see it's not very sharp and very grainy. And I probably wouldn't use this film for anything really important. I think just use this film for something fun, like, I don't know, just like a walk around and like shooting different things. Like, don't use it for family pictures or anything like that. Probably not for regular portraits. I mean, if you're doing like a very experimental photo shoot with people and doing portraits, I think it might be interesting, but know your limitations and know that it's not going to give you best case scenario on the looks. If I had to choose what would be going into a version 2, like a second version of the film, I would say definitely improve the shadow detail and give better sharpness and finer grain, and you definitely have a pretty interesting solid film on your hands, because otherwise I like the look. It's got an interesting color, and then it is a little bit warm tone, so that's there, but of course you could always color balance. But overall I think it has an interesting look aside from its setbacks. What do you guys think about Harman Phoenix 200? Have you shot it yet? And if you haven't, would you be willing to give it a try? Let me know in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time on The Negative.